thanks for coming to our September Milwaukee Sitecore meetup. It's a pretty good turnout. I'd like to see that. If you don't know me, my name is Rick Bauer. I'm one of the organizers of the meetup. I run a small Sitecore consulting firm here in Milwaukee, along with Mark is also one of the other organizers, and Paul, who probably let you in the door if you didn't have a badge to get in. Paul's manning the door so you can get in. Paul, Mark, and I kind of try to organize these. We try and do it for the community. It started a long time ago, focused mainly on developers, and we've kind of broadened that to include the larger Sitecore community. So it's great to see a good turnout. This is probably the second one in a row we've had a pretty good turnout on. We have two presenters tonight, both from one of the main sponsors. Sponsoring for the location is Proficient. We have Mark Servais is going to be presenting on Sitecore best practices, and we have Corey. I'm blanking on your last name.
Just Sitecore.
Yeah, Sitecore. He's going to
Twitter names are okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So Corey's going to present on MVC, kind of MVC from A to Z. So I'd like to thank Laughlin Constable for providing the food and drink. Round of applause for him. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
So I see a lot of new faces, or at least faces I don't recognize. So how many of you folks here, this is your first time? Like some Proficient people raise their hand that it is their first time, but I've seen your faces before, guys, so it's all good.
This is my first time I've ever been to Milwaukee.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously.
Oh, did you see the
Just for you.
Did you see the Fonz?
No.
Oh, you got to see the Fonz. All right, enough about the.
I know which way we're going on the beer crawl.
Pretty much. All right, so I completely wanted to present something to you guys utterly and totally different than best practices tonight. But we're going to do best practices anyway. So, me. I'm no prize, but my background is my Sitecore journey started with Sitecore 6.1 at a local small engine manufacturer and lawn equipment provider. Figure that one out, local Milwaukee people. I've been fortunate enough to be a 4-time Sitecore Technology MVP. Derek already explained I'm one of the co-orgs of this. So I've written a few modules. I've worked in R&D at a previous employer, doing all sorts of connectors and cool stuff. I blog out on the Proficient blog. URLs are, and I'll post these slides later. I started my evil scientist lab, punkcorepipeline.com. It explains why the name, probably not what everybody thinks, but, and then my Twitter handles are on there. Carol Yu, Master of Software Engineering, I've done a lot of time in corporate IT. I was created in Green Bay. I'm a lifelong Wisconsinite, except for I think 3 years where I had a lapse of judgment. Now I'm residing in Waukesha County suburban envelope. So I fit right in. So I like coffee and I listen to a lot of music to just, mellow out, which is not mellow music. So that is about me. You guys know everything there is about me almost as much as my wife. So I was working on this thing called Project Squawk. And what it is, and a lot of people are doing this, is an Amazon Alexa service with the Sitecore hookup, right? Now, we've seen in the community, there's a lot of that happening. I had a particular thing I wanted to do with the framework, and it kind of led me to this after I ran into some identity server problems and some OAuth problems with Sitecore. So I'll kind of get into that when we get to that slide, but I noticed something about Sitecore security. You got it? Well, okay, yeah, perfect. So it kind of got me a little ruffled. So I'll go into that and best practices of what I've seen about some of those things that have come out and that people have been playing with. So what I really want to talk about here are some of the things I run across as kind of violations, potential violations of best practices, what the pain really was because of that, and if we corrected it, kind of the route that we took. I really want this to be interactive, so you folks in the back, especially you, shout out if you guys see anything similar. This is a place of no shame. You're going to see things you've probably seen before, maybe things you've done before as a bad practice. But it's okay. We're here not to judge. So, well, most of us are not here to judge. So,
I really wanted to see the other presentation.
yeah, well, next time. Thanks, Rick. So, lack of governance. People kind of have different reasons for not following best practices. And you guys can rattle some off. There's budgets, timelines. We kind of take shortcuts, right? Sometimes we just don't know any better. A lot of people come out of the Sitecore classes ready to go, and they realize when they get into their first project after taking that certification class, it's quite a bit different. And you're smiling, and you're smiling, and you're smiling, so you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. So let's talk about development best practice, because I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on this. And yes, I have pictures that should entertain you. If they do not, banter between Rick and I guess, will entertain you for the evening. I'm not going to dive into this. Best practices, coding standards, everything that development goes through is important. And we could talk about this for hours. We could talk about this for days. We could argue about tabs and spaces. I don't want to argue about tabs and spaces tonight. I don't care about tabs and spaces tonight. But, ultimately you have to figure out what works for your organization, for what you do, and what you want to adopt. Just because it's a best practice doesn't mean we should all jump on board. I didn't mention Helix down here. I didn't want to talk too much, but Helix is really about that modular architecture for componentization of your Sitecore instance. Personalization, A/B testing, those things really don't happen without that kind of model. So Helix is very, very important. I suggest if you don't know Helix, start learning it, start looking at it. That is a whole nother topic for a future time. All right, so I came across the client who tried to attempt to do localization. Somebody's laughing because they know probably who I'm talking about. And it didn't work out for them so well. So they decided to, instead of kind of following the country, region code, language, format that you typically follow in .NET and in Sitecore, they went with the 2-character ISO for their country. You think, so what? What does that really mean? Well, if you're in Belgium, it's a pretty big deal, right? So once you do that and once you start propagating your content, has anybody ever run into this issue? Oh, some people are nodding. And essentially, it's not an easy cleanup, is it, guys? And you don't know. This is a banter. So I've seen things not using the proper language resolver. People do custom case and if statements to kind of get around that logic. It gets really ugly really fast. And then when it comes time to upgrade, guess what? Sometimes things maybe don't work too well, right? So, take your defaults when you're creating your languages. Don't get cute with it. And if you like IT versus IT-IT, I get it, but you're going to run into problems later. So language fallback, version layouts, and the language resolver are there for you to extend, to utilize for localization. So you shouldn't really either go after code directly or a version of an item directly outside of language context unless there's a good business case to do so. This is where maybe a best practice can be fractured a bit, but you definitely don't want to recreate the wheel and try to do something really cute and desirable. Have your components when you build them rely on using Sitecore's built-in language versions. Don't try to do something a little bit different. You want to fix this? Here's how I fixed it. Serialization. Serialize your content tree. Replace your languages, like with a text search and replace. Bring them back into Sitecore. You think that would be really easy. It's not. It's kind of ugly. And when you're talking about huge sites, like Aurora's site, imagine if you had to change a language and all your content. Would you quit? Maybe, right? So if you're doing some of that custom logic, now you need to rewrite those components. You need to start utilizing that component architecture, data sources. You need to let Sitecore get the right item context and the right version that it was intended to do and not try to overwrite that. If you do find this, your other option is maybe a rewrite if you don't want to go through that problem. But I can tell you, scanning through text documents, looking for language :IT and changing that to language :IT is the most fun a person could ever have in their entire life. So I recommend it highly. All right, now this is what really got me for the Sitecore Alexa thing. So security, like the zip tie, I love the zip tie. Like that's not gonna get broken into. All right, so, I love that picture. There's your security guard, people fighting. So, and he just walks on by. So the hardening guide. So has everybody here implemented the hardening guide on their Sitecore instances? Who hasn't? And that's okay. No, we're not here to judge. All right, so I've come across clients that did not do this. It got difficult. So, right, oh, we tried the hardening guide and something didn't work, so we abandoned the hardening guide. Whoa, okay. Hi, Equifax, how are you doing? So, you know, it's there for a reason. If something's broken, you need to fix it. You know, when we're talking about custom APIs, and this is that Sitecore, Alexa kind of thing, I see a lot of people, it's a request object, it's a response object. Hey, just go get it and come on back. What about security? Oh, we don't need to secure that thing. It's pretty simple, right? Yeah, secure those web services, right? OAuth is the big thing with Amazon to secure. Trust me, it's a little bit more difficult than out of the box. That's why I'm not presenting on Sitecore and Alexa this evening. But it is necessary to lock down every penetration you have to your system. So, oh, and using the admin account for everything. It's like everyone's an admin. How do you know what you changed? Well, the admin did it. Oh. So it's important to identify your roles, your people, get your security set up on your Sitecore instance. So OWASP, is anybody familiar with OWASP? Oh, good, good. For those of you that are not, you need to go out to this website, owasp.org. And what this is, on top of your Sitecore hardening guide, this is a list of best practices to essentially check to make sure that your websites are secure. It's an open platform, people contribute. There are checklists out there for you guys to use. This will solidify you not being Equifax or being that guy who didn't apply that patch. So, marketers, it's a pretty big deal too to make sure that you're on top of a little bit of some of the, I'll call it the IT perspectives of this, because if you're not, and we'll get to a couple of instances later where somebody wasn't, if you're not familiar with it, it can easily slip by. So I get sometimes marketing and IT don't always hold hands and run through the flowered fields together, and I kind of get it, but at the same time, you kind of have to rely on those guys to let you guys know what is needed from a foundation standpoint, from a software engineering standpoint, and you got to kind of know enough to hold them accountable to do it. So sorry, devs. You know, I just kind of threw everybody under the bus, but that's okay. I still love you all. So, all right, that is not what it is, but it's funny. So, secure your APIs, right? And there's a couple ways you can do that. Sitecore Services Client. You can actually do tokenization through that. Ian Graham wrote a blog post. I have it on here. How to do that. So this way you can actually secure things, tokenize, and use Sitecore through tokens versus trying to pass credentials and do anything kind of goofy. You know, I already mentioned the Alexa account linking. So, and I love this. My password used to be baloney. Now I had to add a number. So you change your admin password out of the box if you haven't. Hopefully you have. Then never use admin ever, ever, ever again. Create other roles. Create other people as administrators. Leave admin in an envelope, sealed up to break in case of an emergency. Role-based security. It's talked about in the Sitecore classes. It's important because people leave organizations. Roles typically don't leave. So you definitely want to make sure that your security is down to the role of somebody versus, you know, Rick having special privileges to do something. So, yeah, all right. So use inheritance as much as possible in Security Editor. All right, we talked about hardening guide, NoWasp, and Sitecore Services Client. Here's some more blog posts relating to just basically securing. Don't forget to just to configure your servers right as well. Go through the configuration guides on Sitecore. Do that. People who haven't done this, you've either gotten hacked or have had their site taken over. I can think of one sports franchise that I think had a vulnerability attack because they just didn't follow the simple things that Sitecore had laid out. Claims and tokens. I love tokens. Identity Server 4 and 3 is here. 4 is more for .NET Core, so it's not going to play. If you try to integrate it, it's not going to play with Sitecore very, very well, but it's still something you can use side by side. Not to give anything away of maybe what I'm trying to do. But yeah, we talked about roles and workflow. Don't forget workflow and securing your content and allowing gatekeepers to be able to say, this goes out, this doesn't. Okay, configuration. Has anybody come across a bad configuration in a Sitecore instance? One hand.
Has anybody come across a good?
Maybe that is a better question. Anybody seen it done right? All right, some nods. So I had a client who patched the same patch 7 times in configuration. Yeah, just in case. So when you change the first one, by the time I got to the 5th one, I knew something was up, right? First, I'm like, am I on the right instance? So let's apply patches all over. Don't do that. Don't do that. Figure out your plan of how you want to apply patches. There's some blog posts I'll talk to you about in here that Camru's, thank you, has written that I think are just probably the best that are out there right now as far as patching and organization and everything else. So if you're going to change things, clean up after yourself. That's an old paradigm. I know sometimes people get in a hurry. The case that I had was just residue. It's like, well, it didn't work for me here, so I tried it over here and it seemed to work. Well, yeah, because you have it in 5 different places, right? So it takes time to clean up. And then there is a data folder when you install Sitecore that's currently defaulted out of root, depending on how you install Sitecore, right? You can place it in app data, right? That's pretty secure within the website if you want to keep your logs and all that good stuff. Do not create a folder called data and put it into your website. That comes back to security a little bit. If anybody gains access that way and can traverse your web tree, they got your logs. So that'll be fun for them. So I've seen that a lot where it's like, well, I don't want to keep this outside of that. I'm going to keep it right within my website so everything's in. So, and you guys are sharing war stories back there, I can tell, probably from the same thing.
Sitecore used to default, like 6.2, it used to be.
Yeah.
A data folder.
Yep, and everybody had to move it, and they finally came around. So again, jammy cams, blog posts, hit one, you'll get the rest of them for sure. Get rid of your configuration when you're not using it. Use the data folder config, get that dot example out of there, put your right values in there. Don't be afraid to use an environment value versus a hard-coded path. But make sure that you have that set up properly before going forward. So old business partner of mine, Bill Gates. So content is king. I don't even know if he really said that. The internet said he said that, but whatever. So have some apples. They're really great. Here's where we get to componentization. My whole page is a component. How well does that work, Tim?
Not at all.
In what sense?
Every sense.
Good answer. Personalization.
A/B testing, anything that a marketer would ever ask you to go do.
Yep. What happens when new greenfield projects are set up and people don't follow best practices? They tend to go from a page model perspective, right? And how many people in here have either come across that, had to rescue that, possibly even done it? Yeah, everybody probably at some point, right? So don't do that. It hurts. It hurts really bad for growth. You're wasting your money at that point with Sitecore if you go that route. So I hear this all the time. We work in content editor because that's, that drag and drop stuff's foreign to our folks. Okay, training's pretty cool here, just a little bit. Content editor has its purpose, right? But there are better tools now. Sitecore's evolved, and it's still evolving. So it's really time to start gearing authors and everyone toward the experience editor, trying to get them out of there. Because the biggest problem is when they're in the content editor, a lot of times, again, it comes down to security. We're not securing the roles for people, what they can see and what they can't. So the system directory is wide open. Templates are wide open to non-developers. It can become a mess really quick if a mistake is made. And I'll get into what you do when a mistake is made in a little bit. But icons. You, my friend, Corey, our next speaker, wrote a blog post about that little blue icon, or you made a mention of it, did you not?
Yeah, don't use the blue icon
So-
for your rendering.
Why?
So it makes the content editor awful and the experience editor.
Exactly. So not only for the renderings, everything. If you're going to be in the tree, icons. And if you don't like the icons that are out there, there are blog articles to put your own icons in. Now that's going to be an update thing you got to watch out for. But make things unique, because when you can spot that and your content authors can spot that, oh, here's this, it matches with this, it makes it a ton easier and there's less mistakes about content being bad. Cache everything, because we had performance issues. So therefore, when you actually change something, you have to not only the publish, but then maybe you have to reset IIS, then maybe you have to clear your browser, then maybe you got to do some other things to clear the 7 layers of cache dip that is possible with this. Don't cache everything. Plan that out. And somebody's laughing. I see that. So, you just did that yesterday? Yeah. It's like, well, let's hit IIS. We'll clear everything. That's great for the customer, right? Use caching wisely. It's a tool to be used for performance, not to have that pure I/O and traffic over the wire. But if you're caching everything and you make changes, that can be counterintuitive to your whole purpose whatsoever. And putting content where it shouldn't be. Insert options are important. So there was a great blog by the Burnt Group of CMS architecture decisions. It's really about content architecture. I really like the article. It kind of goes over all of those steps of why you shouldn't do this and why you should do this. Make sure you're thinking about testing. You may not be mature enough now to be at stage 4 of Sitecore's maturity matrix, but you got to think ahead a little bit. And the first thing you can do is just I'm going to break this down into what I think is a testable piece. It doesn't have to be super granular off the bat. It doesn't have to be a whole page either. Find a happy medium for your component. Experience editor is the way going forward. I'm going to plug Ignition here, the framework that we utilize. We have a nice setup with Ignition where Ignition kind of knows if you're in the experience editor, and you can actually have a whole nother view to take care of what you need to do from an author perspective of editing versus what the visitor sees. Correct, right, guys? Oh. So, it's an option for you guys. Just make sure you're cognizant of that author in that environment and give them the tools to be able to change what they need to change. Containers and caching. That's another gotcha. So I only cached the container, but I left the component alone. You're doing the same thing, right? Minification. Cache bust that. And I put a word there with an asterisk because I don't want to be vulgar in front of you guys. So I see too many times where it's like, well, we did minification, I made a change. Oh, now I'm messing around with Chrome, or I have a customer, hey, I don't see the change. Well, refresh 1,000 times. You're right? Not the answer. Cache busting is pretty simple. It's in the next slide, but essentially put a token on the back of your minified files to make them different, so that way they load up again in cache. Sitecore rocks for icons, the best tool out there for icons, bar none. And I talked about loading your icons, and that's right, this doesn't work on a screen. See if you go up right there. There's that article, but remember, when you do an upgrade, you're going to have to carry that along, so keep that in mind for future growth. Insert options, we talked about a little bit. Make sure you lock people down when they need to be locked down and when they need to roam free and do compatible things with compatible renderings on compatible areas. Make sure that happens. And make sure your authors keep that locked down. It's part of that design. All right, environments. No backups, no disaster recovery plans. So I had a client, AWS, their data center, I forget what city it was, went offline. And get a phone call. And it's like, hey, site's down. I'm like, oh yeah, your provider's out. Oh, well, can't you just bring that back up? Yeah, sure. Where's your backups? Oh, they were with the site. Oh, you're down for a while, right? You know, there are instances, disasters can happen. We've seen hurricanes now in the last couple of weeks that have taken out cities and states. My favorite state, Florida. That you're just not going to recover from in a timely manner if you don't have a plan. So, you know, make sure when you think about disaster recovery, it can get pretty exhaustive. You can go too far with it, but try to cover things and going, okay, this is what I need to do in X, Y, and Z. And then you got to take that a step further. I need to test what happens if X were to happen. Can I recover from this tape? Can I recover from that drive? How long is it going to take me? So my marketing folks, I know this is not intrinsic right off the bat.
You talk about localization, now I have to ask the question related to this, how many use CDNs? Are CDNs an automatic backup?
Not necessarily. Eventually your CDN usually has a time limit of how long it's going to store that information because it goes back to the server after a certain duration, right?
Right, but could you double up with, I know it's mainly just for content, but could you use the CDN as a backup?
Can use it as a backup maybe for your visitors at best, but certainly not for your content authors and that whole ecosystem, right? So if you need to get your website up and running so people can get to it, fine. If they're doing processing, if you're doing form post back, stuff like that, you're probably not going to have a great deal of success there. So it's limited, but feasible depending on what kind of site you have. I wouldn't recommend it as your sole backup strategy, but in a pinch, you got to do what you got to do, right? So I've seen instances where people create search indexes because they like to have multiple indexes. So, I'm going to search for cats in this index. So I'm going to create a cats index. Or they'll create new indexes that are exactly like their master and web indexes all the way across the board. When you publish and you do that, it is a mess of time to go through all of those different indexes to restructure your content in those. Only do what you need. And my favorite, as of recently, XDB, I got it installed. Hey, but it's filling up and it's getting pretty big. What do I do? Most people kind of look at it like, well, we need XDB. They never really think about what they're going to do to shard that, what kind of environment they want, what they're going to do when it gets to be too big. How much retention are you really going to have? If I want to keep everything forever, when is when? When do I cry uncle and get some of that stuff off, right? So spend the extra budget on disaster recovery, on hot, cold sites. If you have disaster recovery plans, test them yearly. I worked for that engine manufacturer I had mentioned, lost their network area storage. They were down for 2 weeks because, oops, we didn't have backups on the hot site. The cold site didn't work. Oh, we had to get tapes from a salt mine in Iron Mountain. Oh, those didn't take. The CIO wasn't there much longer after that. He retired suddenly. So I'm not sure if it was because of that. Maybe he had, vacation property. So you got to test those things, right? It is part of that grain. If you're going to invest this much money in purchasing Sitecore and putting it into an ecosystem, test. Make sure things work.
Is your load balancing kind of automatically part of that? I mean, if the server goes down and it's mirrored, it'll just kind of automatically.
Well, in that case, that's what you have the mirroring for, right? So you automatically can kind of continue where you left off until you can fix the problem, right? Either hydrate another server, add it to the node, and then take care of the server there. A lot of times it's really catastrophic disasters where that storage, local area network storage, when that happens, there's no saving anybody when all of those things fail behind. All they needed to do at one point was say, for one weekend, we're off the system. Let's try to restore from tape and see what happens. And if it didn't work, then you start addressing those issues, right? They become part of that backlog, if you will. But the cloud is getting much better at handling those kind of things and keeping things up and running, so which is great.
Mark, quick question.
Mhm.
Have you used the Analytics Database Manager for your XDB cleanups yet?
I have not personally. So you have?
We have. It's still a little interesting, but it allows you to do that purging that you're talking about from an interactions and time frame perspective, but it's still very manual. Not really, and you can extend it and write a job, but it's not something that I think is fully vetted for true automation use yet.
Okay.
So we still go with more in the Mongo management and maintenance plan aspect versus that.
So you're pulling
It's a Sitecore admin tool that can be used by someone with the proper role.
Okay. Is that admin user you mean? Yeah, we don't want to go there. Yeah, what admin user? We got rid of that.
At what point do you need to use that? Like, is it just slow performance? Or?
Slow performance, if you're experiencing a lot of aspects with list locking or anything with list segmentation build-outs and list manager, it helps just clean up and purge that out. Or if you're going to do extractions with experience extractor, it just helps maintain a cleaner XDB interface by purging out interactions. And it gives you several options to choose from, but it's still limited as far as our experience with it.
And that's basically, it works by pulling from the Mongo interface more than anything else,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So kind of a replication of things off. So to that with XDB, that's actually great information. Thank you. Don't ever go with a single server setup in production. Just don't do it. I mean, we see the diagram here of having at least an arbiter between two servers so that the voting can happen. So if something fails, you can switch to the other one. If you know you're going to have a lot of traffic, if you're working with a high traffic site, take a look at Vasily Fomichev's video on setting up Mongo for Sitecore. And take a look at the different sharding options you can do. Yes, it gets complex, it gets more expensive. But certainly if you're kind of doing that single server setup, you're just ripe to fail off of analytics. And if you do have it activated, and if it's down, not only will your Sitecore logs fill up, and that is a lot of fun looking through that, but you may lose some functionality as well, like personalization, some other aspects of things if that thing is down. So keep that in mind. All right, so wrapping up. Again, best practices. Are you following them? And if you don't, there's plenty of information out there to look at best practices, from content to obviously development and everything in between with Sitecore. You don't have to do every one, but you have to take a look at what makes sense. And you do have to think about every one of them and say, listen, if I don't do this, what are the ramifications? If I don't follow language, am I going to be good 10 years down the road when I decide, I want to invade Belgium and now I need to speak 3 different languages? Country code's not going to work. So, it's still a business decision. Are you going to do it or are you not? I can tell you most of the times out of experience, you're going to want to. But, maybe you have that special use case. Maybe you have that special aspect that it's just not a good idea. If you feel a lot of pain doing, finding, solving blank, right? That's a really good indication that maybe you should look and see if there's a best practice for what you're doing, or maybe you need to find a better way of doing it. So nothing should hurt that bad, and that's an indication. Maybe the first couple times, but the third time, if you're going, man, this still is kind of painful to do, maybe it's time to figure something a little bit different out. Why do I come across all these wonderful examples of bad practices? I guess time behind the wheel. So if you've done any of these things, don't leave here crying back to the car when everybody goes out for a beer. It's no big deal. This happens. I've made some mistakes early in my Sitecore career, and I'm glad I kind of did them, because otherwise I wouldn't have learned anything. The fortunate thing about being at Proficient and being a consultant, I get to see a lot of different things. And the fortunate part of that is I get to see a lot of these and get to correct them, and I get to, I can spot them a lot quicker now, where if you're kind of ingrained into it, it's a little bit harder. You're kind of doing your thing. So sometimes it's great to pop up a little bit once in a while and go, okay, what really makes sense here? Kind of challenge yourself. So, all right. Anybody got questions? Anything they want to share of things they've seen?
I have an addition. That's not calling something a best practice. I think something probably a little more useful. What practices do you have that are reusable practices? Beginning, you're talking about issues of time, why you're not potentially doing one thing or another. A lot of that, I think, probably comes out, as you know, is the time it takes to do it again and again and again.
Yeah.
Whatever practices you're following is something that you can automate. If it's documented somewhere, written down in some form, you can probably automate that some way or another.
It comes down to that pain principle, right?
Like, probably one of the biggest pain points for me, time-wise, is, okay, I know I should never use a single server configuration, but why is it, after however many years, Sitecore still doesn't give me the pre-configured configuration for that, and I still got to run through all those little Excel spreadsheets of which half are long, plus the 3 PDFs that come with it, et cetera, et cetera. So some of those things, being lifted out to the organization level and get some feedback there, that'll have reusable practices. It's also a best practice.
Let me assume that since you've gone through the pain of that and separating that you have some images now that you hydrate?
Well, every time you have an implementation, it's a new version, you still got to go through the same thing again.
Sure. Or you can just go through the upgrade steps prior to 8.
Another manual process, right? Well, there's a wizard now which works, quote unquote.
Actually, it's not too bad if you're on the right versions, right? It actually does. It does the job. It's sometimes a little bit more effort than others. It depends too on what your instance looks like when you start. That's a big part of it, right? So thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
I'll just throw out there for that experience editor comment. Absolutely start pushing more and more into that. Even Sitecore's walk-through windows for personalization and A/B testing are being almost solely dependent upon that. So make sure that you are pushing towards that direction. And that ties into roles too. The use of roles and the forever long documentation from Sitecore on the roles that you have to have in order to do the right things for A/B testing and personalization. There's role names that don't make sense that you need to read their documentation to make sure you give to people in order to actually let them, they can create the test, but they can't approve a test, and the dialogue doesn't show the workflow that all falls into it. There's a lot of nuances and best practices to kind of learn about when you're getting everything set up to do marketing work in Sitecore. Roles, security, all that, all fall back to it.
A little emphasis on workflows too.
Yes. Workflows is a big part of it.
Workflows is huge. I mean, it's one of those things I see most neglected of not being put in, and then, down the road, people are like, well, this has gotten out of control. Well, yeah.
This might be off topic, but
Nothing's off topic here, so you're good.
I'm kind of just getting started with Sitecore and with my company that I just started with. And,
Okay.
How we're getting the training, we got that all in our package.
Okay.
How much does the training, I'm sure you build a site out as an example.
Mm-hmm.
How closely, do you know how closely they follow best practices?
They
Like the ideal standard?
Yeah, they do. The training, at least the latest one that I've been looking at, is much better.
A lot better. Is it the one with the adventure company? Yeah, that's a good one.
It is, okay.
Yeah, the earlier ones maybe not so great. Like back when I started.
Six stuff.
Yeah. It was.
Good to know. We got our money's worth.
So your devs out of the.
Yeah, the piece to notice is they will not cover helix, which is the way everything's moving now. So I'd highly recommend that. Take it for what it's worth, right? There's definitely value there, but the way everything's moving is going to change.
Right.
So the paradigm shift and the way you have to think about components installation and all that kind of stuff.
Is there any training out there for Helix?
There is a module now.
It's limited for specific partners right now, but
Yeah, it is. Yeah. My name is Rich, by the way. I'm a Minneapolis-based Sitecore regional director covering Wisconsin as well. And I don't think that Helix is quite yet available for the public, but soon will be.
Soon will be.
And this is Andy Coyce, who's Chicago-based SE for Sitecore.
Glad to be here, Bill. This is good.
Glad you guys can make it.
So yeah, it's been limited, but I think it's very soon that it will be available. So stay tuned.
Okay.
Like by the end of the year? Or?
Yeah, I think it was supposed to be late summer originally, so maybe fall.
Helix is a fairly new thing, so it probably took a while to put that
You have a
together.
demo environment that's built on Helix, right? You
Called
can download
Habitat.
it and take
There
it.
is a Helix specific training class, but that's specifically for developers.
That's part of
Yeah.
the
Is that part of it? Yeah.
But are you working with an SI right now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, ask your SI about it. Hopefully they have some
Yeah,
resources
I will,
for you.
for sure.
And if you just want some good reading, there's like a 100-page documentation online that you can go get inside of it.
And I think the biggest problem there is you still do have so many instances of Sitecore and so many different versions with so many SIs that have been implemented in so many different ways that it's just going to take a fairly massive amount of time to get somewhere that's where it's something that every company is doing what Sitecore now considers best practices. Because up until this, Sitecore says we're a platform, build it as you like, as you need it, and that's exactly what everybody did, and that's kind of the crux of it.
What exactly is Helix used for? I mean, is it like a code?
It's an architectural pattern.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's code.
It uses MVC, but it's like how do you structure your solution? How do you make it so that your components are scalable and easily reusable,
So it will,
easily maintainable? Yeah.
is it like a platform where you would develop, you'd have to refactor your code
Yeah.
within
It depends, it totally depends on how well it was architected to begin with. Sometimes it's not as difficult, sometimes, and it starts with which version of Sitecore it was implemented in. Older versions,
So if you're starting from scratch.
starting from scratch, it is what you want to start with.
So we were just talking, this is exactly the kind of dialogue we want at all of our meetings.
Keep talking. I have a bunch of swag that Sitecore was kind enough to send our way, so throw these little mini footballs out to you.
No, be careful when you throw the footballs.
Oh man.
Better make sure there's eye contact.
Yeah. So just throw them out. Anybody else got any questions?
I'll just add, regardless of whether you choose. That's terrible throw. It's also terrible. Please do not.
Sorry, man. Children. What do you do?
Sorry, Russ.
I was gonna say, regardless of like whether you decide Helix or not, or similar architecture, I was just gonna add that I think you can also just be smart about your components. Like we had one slide where you're only as good as your weakest link with the security. Same is true with a bad component. If you put, 8 components on your page, and all of a sudden the page is dead and broken, and you don't know what caused it, and you'll probably end up tracking it down to one bad component that wasn't checking for null or something like that. We've got quite a list of bad components, so we're kind of going through that. I think you tackle those best practices first, and then you get to the architecture decisions.
I'm sorry I ruined all of your components. No, I'm just kidding. No, and that's what code reviews and things like that, that helps catch some of that as well. So those are important. I know we didn't touch on it a lot here. We don't have a pure developer audience. I didn't want anybody not a developer falling asleep. Hopefully, it looked like everybody stayed awake, so I'm pretty happy about
Business
that.
value versus investments. If you've got something that reasonably works today and needs some adjustments, then make those adjustments to make it work better. If you're starting greenfield, definitely look at what Sitecore has been recommending now for some time.
And use Ignition.
Security, if you are looking to do security scanning, there are some third-party extensions that will allow us to get into like your top 10 security vulnerability. Yeah. So there are a number of third parties out there that we're looking.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of them we do trial periods, trials and stuff.
And I know there's several popular ones. I think HP has a very good popular one where you get so many scans that go live, and then once every so often that works, but at cost. So It's all a matter of how sensitive your data is too.
Speaking of security, we think how many people have their site running on their network service? You do?
Well, not by production. That would be weird. But yeah, that's a big common problem too.
Part of it is this one with SIM, right? Because SIM has that. If you're running a network service, so.
All right. If anybody's got any questions, I have to close up the place, so I'll be here at the very end. So thank you guys very much. I'm glad you guys came out. Now the real action's going to start. So hopefully I got you guys warmed up for Corey coming up next. Take about 5 minutes.
The bathrooms are around the corner. I can show people
Thank you.
All right. So supposedly you did something.
You can't prove it.
We can't even say the word better around the office without being like, boom. It's crazy how one simple idea, one word better, could just totally take over, and you're seeing it everywhere.
Basically, to go along with the TV commercial of a family trying to sink a raft, we shot in 360 video the family partaking in the TV commercial activity, which was trying to sink this raft.
We do over 1,000 versions of spots per year.
Recently, we had the opportunity to do a video, which it happened to be in the super sexy category of foil lidding. It's still about telling a good story, and it's still about, talking to people as human beings.
It's truly rewarding to go and help somebody who's doing something great for the community. Any community, if they're doing something great, we want to be behind it.
It's an example of what really good social media can look like. It can be thought-provoking, and it can get people thinking. We thought maybe this is a way to sort of take that negative energy associated with the election and turn it into something positive for breast cancer. It just so happens that there's a right and left in politics and a right and left in breasts.
For last summer, the agency produced 2 spots. One of them was about dogs, and then another spot we did was all about the supper clubs. And then what's really neat with it is that we were able to extend that experience into the real world by creating physical supper clubs into sports arenas. So yeah, I think they serve like 20-ounce old fashions there, which is just what you need.
Someone in the agency had a contact with a really great artist, Frank Anderson, who's an animator, illustrator, musician. He does everything, and he basically did it for nothing because he believed in the cause. I mean, it doesn't happen often in any agency, I don't think. I think it's pretty rare that you find something that people are so excited about that they're jumping to work on it for free.
The work is just a complete testament to craft, both in writing and art direction. There isn't a single image that you'll see in any of the work, from the outdoor to the print posters, that doesn't just scream, read me, look at me, spend some time with me, because there isn't a detail that's been missed.
It just seemed like a really fresh way of doing things. If a script wasn't working there on the spot, we'd just go and change it and feed them lines. It seems like things will be going more that way, where we have more control over the creative, and then we have more control over the final product, because these projects can be done in-house, which is just an exciting prospect.
Hi everyone. Somebody whistled, y'all quieted down. Yeah. This is Corey, Sitecore. Corey Smith. He's going to show us MVC A to Z, which even I know the alphabet, so this should be pretty straightforward. Even I can be here.
Right.
So without further ado, Corey, take it away. Everybody give Corey a hand.
Thank you. So I will start this with a warning. This is going to be a very technical heavy demo. So if there's anyone in here who's not a developer, who honestly, if you just get bored, you want to go back and have a beer, I won't be offended. I understand. Well, no, have a beer anyways. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so a little bit about myself. I'm a 2017 Sitecore MVP of Technology. I work with Proficient, not in this office. I work in Atlanta. Actually, Courtney, Scott, and I were on site for a client right now in Madison and drove over for this fine Sitecore user group. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, no joke, at Sitecore. And my website is corysmith.co. I blog about Sitecore regularly there, so check it out, leave some comments. Yeah, so MBC, those three big letters, Sitecore is obviously pushing really hard for everybody to be on MBC these days. No more web forms for Sitecore. If you are on web forms on your projects, I hope that you're getting some budget to migrate off. If you're doing greenfield projects, I hope that you're absolutely doing those on MBC.
Show of hands, how many are on web forms?
Thank you, David. And those of you on web forms, how many of you are getting budget to get off of web forms? Wow, the unicorn. All right. Yeah, so, I mean, if you do MBC in Sitecore, it's very probable that your experience with MBC doesn't go beyond those three letters, MBC, right? MBC standing for Model View Controller. But the truth is, with MBC, all the magic that goes into that, there's a lot more, right? Like in this word cloud I have here, there's model binders, action filters, result filters, controller factories, et cetera, et cetera. And today, I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction about some of those things that happen between the MB and C to make that stuff work. And I hope that you can take something away today and implement it on your project tomorrow, even to clean up your code a little bit and really make use of the framework. So the first thing I'll talk about is really routing. That's how requests get into MVC. Now, one thing that I will say is in Sitecore, if you're not doing AJAX, routing's really not important. Actually, Sitecore doesn't take advantage of it whenever it's generating your controller renderings, for example. Like if you've made a controller rendering before, you just put in the controller name and the action name, and Sitecore knows how to hit that without any help. But if you are doing AJAX, and like on a traditional MVC application, routing is just like the item resolver in Sitecore. It takes your URL and says, okay, from this URL, this is the item that we want to resolve. Or in MVC's case, this is the controller we want to use to do some work. So yeah, it just maps the controller to an action. And Sitecore actually comes with one out of the box that I've got here. It might be a little bit small for you folks in the back, but it's just /API/Sitecore/controller/action. And you can get to any of the controllers in your application this way. If you want to add more, it's possible. If you want to add your own company branded route, you can do more with the initialize pipeline. Just put in a pipeline processor before or after initialize routes. Why would you do it one way or the other? Well, if you're writing some routes that you don't need some Sitecore pipelines running around, like the MVC pipelines, put your pipeline processor after initialize routes. If you do it before, Sitecore is actually going to do some bootstrapping for you to make sure that the MVC pipelines run around it and give you a little bit of extra functionality. So just keep that in mind. I think that in most cases, you probably want to put your routes before initialize routes, but you're the better judge. So how to add? Again, if you guys want to come up to the front and the back or not, it's going to be kind of small. This is like the font size all night, but
feel free if you guys want to move up. Go ahead, take the chairs if you want. If you really like the chair that you're in, and go ahead, get a little bit closer. Don't be shy.
Derek, I appreciate it.
Slides will be shared, right?
Huh?
He's the only one. Yes, sir.
I just want to make sure I understood that last slide, but this sounds pretty awesome, that I can create a custom controller and I don't have to create a presentation to test it. I can actually test it to that URL.
Yeah, you don't even have to do that. I mean, you can actually instantiate your controller like in a unit test, right?
Yeah.
Just new it up and then call the actions, and that works too. But yep, that's another way. So how to add? Again, I apologize to the people in the back, but this is just a sample pipeline processor. And whenever you're adding new routes, you just specify this URL property here. It's going to start off with like your route name. So this might be your company name, like Proficient API, if it were us maybe. It could be anything. And then you just supply some tokens in the URL, like controller, action, and ID. And it's MVC's job to go, and whenever you send in a URL like myroute/something/something/something, MVC is actually going to take that apart and figure out, okay, well, this first segment's the controller name, the second segment's the action name, the third section's the ID. And you can specify some defaults, right? So you could specify a default controller name if that segment's missing, or the carousel item as a default action name. And over here, I've just got a list of like what routes would actually apply to this controller, and you can see it's 4, right? I can go as simple as just not specifying the controller or the action segments, or I can specify all of it, and MVC will fill that out for me and find the controller. Another thing to keep in mind is that just like items in Sitecore, where you can have multiple URLs go to a single item, you can have multiple routes go to a single Sitecore item. I think that follows with what I said, right? If you want to add your own route, right, that Sitecore route is still going to be there by default. You're just adding another vanity route just for URL and display purposes. But whenever you do that, you may want to make some distinctions between what routes are calling into your controller, right? If you've got 2 different ones, maybe you want a little bit different functionality whenever your controller is hit from route A versus route B. And the way that you can do it, again, apologies to the folks in the back, but there's this route data property in the controller where you can actually go and look at the values of that. And so what you can do is when you specify your routing definition, you could just put an attribute on it like my route equals true. Right, that's not going to be on any other route that Sitecore or anybody else makes. So you can just go look in that route data dictionary and say, hey, if that value is present, I know that this route's getting called. Another big question might be, when is Sitecore calling your controller, right? You might want to have some different behavior. If Sitecore is calling your controller for a controller rendering, you're going to have a lot of things available to you that wouldn't otherwise be available to your controller through an AJAX call. So like Sitecore is going to make data sources available to you and other context things that aren't going to be available in AJAX. And so whenever Sitecore calls your controller, there is always going to be this SC is fall through property in the route data dictionary that you can look for, and hey, Sitecore called it for a controller rendering versus me calling it through AJAX. And here in this code, I've just got something simple to show off. Like if Sitecore is calling it, maybe I'll go get the carousel item from Sitecore's data source because I know that's provided to me. But if I'm getting it through AJAX, maybe I'll pass in the carousel ID in the query string, and then I'll just go get it out of the database from that. So once we've got routing done, MVC's figured out, hey, which controller do we want to call? But before that controller is actually called, there's a bit of stuff that's going to happen first. The first thing is there's going to be a controller factory that's actually responsible for going and instantiating your controller. And then once that's done, then the action actually has to be invoked, and that's going to be done by something called an action invoker. So the action invoker, it's pretty cool. This leads to probably one of my favorite things in MVC, which is filtering. Filtering is pretty powerful. I think this is one of the really big benefits that you get whenever you use MVC over web forms. And basically, it lets you kind of pull your cross-cutting concerns out of your code and put them in their own classes, right? So if you take, for example, logging, right? Maybe you want to go and do some performance testing on all of your actions in your code. Well, there's one way that you could do it, and you could go on every single one of your actions, and on the first line, you could do stopwatch.start. On the last line, you could do stopwatch.stop and then write that to a log. If you've got 2 or 3 controllers, that might be feasible, but I've been on projects where there are hundreds of controllers, right? And that's just not going to cut it. So that's where filtering comes in. You can just write these classes that'll wrap those actions in that functionality. And there are quite a few types of them. There's authentication filters for making sure that you are who you say you are and you're logged into the site, right? If you're not logged in, it might just redirect you to a login page. Authorization filters to make sure that you actually have rights to actually execute that action. Action filters, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Result filters. And then exception filters are pretty handy. Whenever the action invoker is actually invoked by MVC, you can imagine that there's actually a big try-catch around the action invoker whenever it runs. That's actually the case. And in that catch, it goes and runs all of your exception filters. So if any of these filters fail, or if your controller action fails, you can have some just generic exception handling in an exception filter to handle that stuff, and that's really nice. So there are a couple of ways to register those, and I'll cover them later. Authorization filters, I think I heard somebody talking about anti-forgery tokens. Anti-forgery tokens are actually validated through authorization filters. Authorization filters are also good for things like protocol validation. So if you want to ensure that your controllers are getting hit through HTTPS, there's an out-of-the-box HTTPS attribute that you can put on those, and it'll look at the URL and say, hey, is this an HTTPS URL? No, let me redirect you, and then it'll let you through. And it's also good for authorization, right? Do you have the access rights to run this thing? One thing to keep in mind is that if you use these authorization attributes, they're not going to execute if you have an allow anonymous attribute on there. So if you can imagine, you could put an authorization attribute onto a controller and it'll apply to all the actions in that controller. Well, maybe you want one of those actions to be available to anyone. You can just slap that no or allow anonymous attribute on there, and it won't run the authorization filters. After those run, there will be action filters. Action filters run right around your action, right before and right after. There are a couple of methods: on action executing and on action executed. On action executing, that's your first, or really your last chance before your action executes for you to do something. Like maybe you even want to prevent that action from executing. And then on action executed, that's your first chance after it's actually run to do something. Result filters. So result filters, whenever you're working in MVC, your actions, you're going to return a view. You might return a partial view. You might return JSON. You could return any of those. The thing to keep in mind is that when you return those things, that's actually the command pattern. It's not actually doing anything at that instance when you return it. All it's doing is giving off a command to MVC, and it's saying, hey, at some point in time, I want you to generate a view, or some point in time, I want you to generate JSON from this. And so result filters, where they come in, is right before that result executes and right after, you can do some more stuff. I'm going to give a demo of where you can use result filters, but I think action filters will cover about 99% of your cases. I mean, they're good for things like, modifying the response if you need to change a content type or something like that, or doing some kind of caching. If generating your result is really expensive, you could put caching around that. So another thing, you can put filters at various levels in your application, so they can go on the action level, which would be the most granular. You can put them on the controller, so they apply to all the actions on that controller. You can apply them globally, so they apply to every single action in your application. Or you can also just go and put them directly on your controllers. So the controllers that you use, they're all filters. They actually have convenience methods on them that you can override, so you can just go and implement these action functionality within the controller. A couple of best practices. So like I just said, controllers are filters. Sitecore actually comes with some global filter pipelines out of the box. There's this MVC action executing, action executed, result executed, and exception pipelines that you can actually just go drop some pipeline processors in. And those pipeline processors will actually run for every single one of your actions in your application. And Sitecore actually ships with one exception handler out of the box that's in that MVC exception pipeline. However, I'll warn you, don't use global filters in Sitecore. In my opinion, I think that they're a bad practice, and I'll show you how to avoid that in just a minute. So without further ado, I'll step into a demo. I'm going to hop into Visual Studio. So I've got this.
Might need a larger code for it.
Yeah, I know.
You can blame Mark for that.
So I've got this demo site that I set up. It's a really simple site built on Bootstrap. It's not doing anything fancy. I've got a nav bar component that I made. I've got a Jumbotron component, and then these little tile components. But you can imagine that maybe your client comes to you and says, hey, we want to start making this thing more responsive. We want to do a single page app with it. So maybe we want to convert this Jumbotron into an Angular component, right? Okay, well, how do you do that? Right now, it's just a controller rendering. Well, what you might want to do is you might want to just return that view model that you're using to generate this Jumbotron out as JSON. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to open up my Jumbotron controller. And I'm going to ask you guys, can you see this? How much bigger should I make it? That's too big.
That's right.
How about that?
No.
A little bigger.
No. Bigger.
Well, if I go any bigger, then I can't put any more on the screen. Like, I'm gonna actually start writing code. If you want to see, you got to come up. I'm sorry. Nobody wants to see. So this is my controller action. It's gonna just basically go off to Sitecore, get the data source item. It's not doing anything fancy, and then it's making a view model that it's sending down to the view. So like I said, you might want this to return JSON in certain circumstances. So maybe you do something silly like say, okay, well, if JSON is in the query string, then we'll return JSON. Well, one way that you could do that is you could come down here and just put a little if statement and say, if in the query string we see JSON, then instead of returning a view model, return JSON. That works. But we know that once we show this to our clients, they're going to be like, hey, we want this on every single one of our controllers. We want all of our components to support this, right? So it's not going to scale. I'm not going to go put that on every single one of my actions. So a better way to do that would be to take advantage of the fact that your controller is an action result. So you can come in here, and you can actually do override on action executed. And so what I want to do is as soon as my controller has executed, I want to say, hey, we're returning a view result. Let's not do that. Let's return a JSON result instead. And that's pretty easy. So the first thing that we can do is we can just go in here in this method and we can say, all right, let's get into the filter context. This is just a property that's applied to you. It provides a lot of information about the context of that filter running. And you can go look at the request and say, all right, so if JSON is not in the query string, then just return, don't do anything, right? All right, so the next thing we need to do is get our result and change it. So that's pretty easy. You just come in here and you can say, all right, your view result, you can pop that out of the filter context, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get that result out as a view result base. And then if it's null, I'm not going to do anything, right? Like you might have some cases where you're already returning a JSON result. We don't need to do anything in that case. All right, so we've got our result. Now we need to change it. And that's easy too. So the first thing you do is get your view model out of the view result. Get that out. That's easy enough. And then just make a new JSON result. Just new that up like that. You can take your model, put it on the JSON result, and then you've got to do a little something. By default, MVC doesn't let you get JSON from a controller when on a GET request. It's just a security thing. It only lets you return JSON by default on posts. So if you want to have a GET request return JSON, you have to set this JSON request behavior to allow GET. All right, so we've got our JSON result, and now all we have to do is just set that back on the filter context. And that's it. So we just did that same functionality, and I didn't touch any of the code up here in my controller action, which is awesome, right? Now I can just start getting this across all my actions in the application. So let's publish. Say a little prayer to the demo gods. And we did this on the Jumbotron. So if all goes well, we should see this not render HTML anymore, but we should see it render JSON whenever we put JSON equals true in the query string.
On Sitecore, you can do it.
This is 90% of my day. All right. Well, we've got some disbelievers in the audience. However, you see a whole bunch of HTML, but if we look right here, you can actually see that we got the Jumbotron back as JSON. It's not HTML. So what happened? So in a typical MVC application, you would only have one controller responding to a request. In Sitecore, you can have hundreds, you could have thousands, right? You can have hundreds of thousands of components on a page. By default, whenever you return a view in MVC, it doesn't set the content type on the response. It's just null, and I guess later on MVC says, okay, it's going to be HTML. But if you return JSON, it's going to set the content type on the response to application JSON. Well, we're returning a JSON result inside one of our controllers. Therefore, you're seeing this come back as HTML. Chrome's not rendering it. So how can we fix that? Well, we know that before the result executes, the response has the right content type. So why don't we just, before this JSON result executes, we can go grab the content type, and then after it executes, let's just put it back, right? Just override the application JSON content type. So that's easy too. Just go in here and we can, again, take advantage of the fact that the controller is a result filter. And we can say on result executing, because that's basically the last chance before that result executes to do anything with it. And we can just come in here and say, okay, let's get the current content type. So I'm just going to look back at the filter context, go to the HTTP context. This time I'm going to go to the response instead of the request and grab that content type. Okay, well, we got that. Where are we going to put it? We need it somewhere to use to grab back out of. Well, that's where the controller actually has something called a view bag, which is a nice place that you can just stick a bunch of stuff in. It's a dynamic object, so you can actually create properties on that view bag. What are you laughing about? Yeah, it's a bad name, but the view bag, you can put anything you want into it, so let's put something in the view bag. So the filter context actually gives you a handle to your controller. So if we go to that controller, you'll see there's my view bag, and you can just put any property you want onto it. So I'm going to put a content type property on it. Again, like this class, you can just put anything on there, and then I'll store my content type. And now, actually, I need to change the name of this. Let's do this. There we go. All right, and now we've got our content type saved. So now let's go and set it back. So before the result executed, we saved it. Now we'll do on result executed. We'll get our content type back out of the view bag, Rick.
That's why I'm not a newscaster.
So we can go back to the controller, go back to the view bag, get the content type, and then we can just set that on the response.
What was the first override that you did?
What's that? On result executing.
So you did two on result executing.
On result executing, so that code will run before the result executes, and then on result executed will run after the result executes. So you can just kind of imagine this is going to execute in sequential order, right? On result executing, then somewhere here in between, the result will it'll actually generate the JSON or HTML depending on what you're doing, and then after that, we're just going to go and set the content type back on the response. So I'm going to publish this, and with any luck, whenever we refresh the page this time, it will actually render.
Go check Twitter.
Yes, always check Twitter during Sitecore builds. Never during Sitecore development.
Plenty of time.
Come on.
It worked. So we've got JSON up here. That's cool. And then just to prove a point, if I take JSON equals true off, comes back as HTML. So cool. But right now, this is only applying on this one controller to this one component. We know the client's going to say, wow, this looks really fantastic. We want to apply this onto all controllers. Well, that's really easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come down here and down in my project, I'm going to make a new class. And I'm not going to be very clever with it. I'm just going to call it a JSON filter attribute. And this attribute, it just needs to subclass action filter attribute. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here into my controller and I'm just going to cut this code that I did. I mean, they're implementing the exact same interfaces, so that's why this works. Paste that there. Change the access modifiers on the methods. And now we've got a nice class that kind of encapsulates this JSON filter functionality, right? It's all bundled up together. So now what I can do is I can just go back here on my Jumbotron controller, and I can just put this JSON filter like that, and it gives the exact same functionality. MVC is going to go and it's going to see that attribute, and it's going to run all those methods for me at the appropriate times. But again, let's not stop there. Got a question? Yes, sir.
Since you're using an object-oriented language, why not just use variables versus the attribute? Instead it's going to apply to all of the controllers. You're just extending instead of base controller, the custom controller, so we have that functionality plus whatever that reusable code is in there.
Well, if you want to have more than one of them run, then it's going to get messy to put all that stuff into one method, right?
Hence the calling base or super.
Well, that's.
End up needing at least more than one base controller. You have a base controller plus a base controller with the JSON functionality.
Yeah, so that's.
Extending a different controller, right? Because it'd be a different categorization of functionality. Say this isn't just a base controller. This is my JSON result controller, which is a base controller. Is a relationship instead of has a.
Right, but so then what if you want that to apply to all of your actions, but not all of your controllers inherit from that similar base controller, right? What if you want that to apply to your Sitecore controllers that are executing, like that are Sitecore actually running? You don't have any control over what controller those inherit from. So that's where these filters come in.
So the attribute you created, you still have to put that attribute on those classes, correct?
No, not technically. So there's actually a way that you can go and register this in a global filters static property, and MVC will take care of that and apply it to all your controllers regardless of what they inherit from. But like I said earlier, I kind of recommend against that, because if you go and stick attributes into that global filters static property, that's going to apply to everything in your application, right? That's not just your stuff, that's Sitecore stuff too. So if you do that, then you extend your testable surface, and you can potentially break Sitecore stuff, right? Like you don't know 100% where Sitecore is calling its controllers. So what if one of their controllers, for some silly reason, actually uses that JSON query string parameter for something, right? Okay, now you're going to start breaking Sitecore stuff because all of a sudden it's going to start running or returning JSON results. So to your point, what I was going to say is that you can go and put that attribute on a base controller, like I've got set up here, and then this will actually run for all of the controllers that inherit from that base controller. So if we go and publish this,
The minimal impact.
exactly.
If you're taking over someone else's code that has some other base controller architecture,
Well, what if you have some libraries where you don't have control over the controllers and what types they inherit from? Sounds like a lot of work.
and for some reason, Microsoft has got the attribute-based programming.
So,
And it's easier to see it.
right.
If you're constantly looking at controllers, it's nice to see the filters. In my perspective.
Agreed. So there we go. Now that's on the base controller. Every single one of my components on the page is coming back as JSON instead of HTML. If I go to the About page, there was a carousel here, and you can see that it's coming back as JSON as well. And I didn't have to make any kind of modifications to those controllers at all. So I think that's pretty awesome. So one other thing that I think that really separates MVC apart from web forms that really makes it awesome is the model binders. So these are basically responsible for populating your action parameters. It can bind simple models like bool, char, int, string. It can also bind complex models, which I'll show off. And the way that this works is that it basically looks at 4 places in the request. It looks at query string, form data, looks at the request body and route data, and it goes and looks for anything that matches those parameter names that you put into your action, and it tries to pull them out and cast them to the right type. So this is really awesome for providing data to your controllers without taking direct dependencies on HTTP context, right? Like now, whenever you're doing your unit testing, you can start passing stuff in through those action parameters instead of going and looking at the request object and doing all that mundane casting. So this is an example right here. I mean, in traditional web forms, and I see this a lot in MVC projects still today, if you wanted to go and just get something called myInt out of the request query string, you've got to go do all this, right? It's a lot of ceremony. You got to go look at the query string, you got to go get that value out, you got to cast it to int, but that's not necessary in MVC. All you have to do in your action parameter is just specify this int myInt. MVC is going to go look for that myInt property somewhere, and it's going to cast it into the type for you. Even better, whenever you've got a complex type, like I've got here my view model that's got a bool, it's got a char, int, and a string on it. Again, MVC is just going to go and roll through all the properties on that model, and it's going to look at their types, find them in the form data, the query string, anywhere it can in the request, and put them into that model for you. And I think that's really nice. I hate writing this code. It's unnecessary. MVC does it for you. Model binding you can get pretty complex with. You can actually write your own custom model binders to pull from other places. You can write custom value providers. I've blogged about that before. If you want to try to bind from Sitecore directly into your action parameters, this is something I could probably talk about all day. I highly encourage you, at the very least, even more so than action filters, if you walk away with anything today, start using model binders in your controllers whenever you're trying to get stuff from requests. So once we've gotten done with the action, we've got a result return. It's either a JSON result, view result, whatever. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is view engines, because usually we're going to be returning views, and the view engine plays a big part in that. So what the view engine does is basically it just drives the folder structure and conventions in your project. Whenever I first started on MVC, the first thing I noticed was Microsoft always gives you 3 folders: controller, models, and views. And I learned very quickly that if you move a view out of one of those folders into the wrong place, your controller stops working. So I just thought, okay, well, if I move the controller out of the controllers folder, it's probably not going to work. If I move the models, that's not true. The only thing that matters is the location of your views. And the reason that matters is because of the view engines. The view engines, they have one responsibility, and that's to go and find your views, right? So by default, MVC is always going to go look in this views controller action.cshtml. That's where it's going to look for your views. It'll also look in shared action. Now, this only happens if you don't hard-code your view paths. So people who are using MVC, do you hard-code your view paths? Who's doing that? You do?
Sometimes.
Why?
I'm trying to think why.
just that's the way you've done it?
Maybe we have 2 views, so under a certain circumstance.
You need to return a different one?
So we're swapping.
Right. That's a good example.
That would be
Yeah.
the only way. Then otherwise we would rely on the view engine to just match it up.
Yeah.
So you mean hardcode the whole path and let it parameterize it? So for instance, if you want to check the views, right, so you have multiple different levels of variation of views.
Right.
You may have some sort of visual path that you parameterize.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and I've done similar as far as dynamically controlling the view path
Right.
based off of what type of result I was expecting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like Mark mentioned, in Ignition, one of the things that we do is we actually will return a different view if you're in the experience editor. So you can just like have a view name, myview.cshtml, and if you want to have some slightly different markup in the experience editor, you can just make myview.ee.cshtml, and we've got a view engine that'll intelligently go and look for that different view. And if it's there, it'll use that one. If not, it just uses what you've already got in place. So there are situations where you could and need to hard code view paths. Actually, you can get a little bit of a performance increase, very small. So if that's like, the most important thing to you, hard code the view paths. But I don't think you should. And so just to kind of drive the point home, like over here on the left, I've got what a standard MVC project structure might be like. But I don't like that, right? Like, I've been on projects where it's structured like this, and we've got, again, literally hundreds of controllers in the controllers folder, hundreds of views in the views folder. And it's like, well, whenever you want to go touch the header controller, you're probably going to have to touch the header view, and you're spending all day scrolling up and down through the Solution Explorer, and you don't need to do that. Like I said, it doesn't matter where the controllers and the views and the models live. So what I recommend is just go and start putting those right alongside your view, right? Well, that feels a little bit gross, right? Like, why am I putting code in the views folder? I don't really like that. So what I'll do is take it a step further and just name that folder components. And that's pretty easy. All you have to do is just go and make a view engine that looks just like this. Inherit from Razor View Engine. Go and specify your location formats like I'm doing here. So component/1. That 1 is always going to get replaced with the controller name. 0 is going to get replaced with the view name. Register that with MVC, and you're good to go. There are a couple of ways you can do it. In Sitecore, you're going to want to make a pipeline processor and put that in the initialize pipeline. And what you'll do is actually the view engines that MVC uses, it's a collection. So you can have more than one, right? Like you can do that components convention if you want, and still get the regular view convention if you want to do that. So just always make sure that you put your view engines up at the top of that collection so that those get hit first. But another way I would recommend is instead of doing it in the view, again, like go back to a base controller. Like, you don't know if you're adding a new convention globally, that's okay. I don't think Sitecore is ever going to care about that. But if you're doing some crazy dynamic stuff, might be better to just go put that on your base controller's view engine collection, and then only your controllers will be affected by this new functionality. And you can just do that there by overriding initialize in your base controller and just inserting your view engine the same way into the view engine collection for your controller. However, if you're using html.partial in your views anywhere, that's not going to work. You have to use the static collection. There's no way around it. The view engines from your controller aren't passed to html.partial. It always uses that global collection, so you've got to use that. One thing that I would recommend is that whenever you're doing these custom view engines, make really focused ones instead of like a monolithic one, right? I think that's more maintainable. So if you want to have several different conventions, like a components folder, or Sitecore folder, whatever, make separate view engines for each of those and register them all. Don't stick that into one big view or one big view engine if you can avoid it. So that's all I've got on MVC. The last thing that I wanted to point out is the reference source. So Microsoft actually makes all of the ASP.NET Web Stack available as open source for you to go and download and poke around with. It's actually really clean code. It's easy to understand. All you have to do is just go to this site, clone that stuff, open up the solution. You can make a new project in there and start debugging and dig down into the internals and really see how MVC is doing its job. It's pretty cool. So with that, any questions? Yes, sir.
You didn't talk about dynamic rendering versus partial rendering or static rendering.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you do treat with care when designing a view?
Oh, it just depends. Like, I guess with dynamic versus static, are you talking about like in your views calling controller or like Sitecore controller rendering and in getting them directly like that versus like having a placeholder or?
Yeah, but like Sitecore dot placeholder.
Right.
You would be defining a placeholder in a view, and then you add all your other child components into that page or whatever.
Right.
Versus like saying, I'm gonna actually use the HTML dot partial render. And
Right.
just statically type the
Right.
component for the header and for the footer. I've heard that there's performance improvements for statically finding it, and I'm just wondering,
It just depends, right? You just got to be pragmatic. I mean, I think if you've got some place on the page where the content author should never have control over what goes into that place, then use the static renderings. But if the content author does need to put stuff there, you've got to put a placeholder. There's no way around it. I mean, one instance of like using a partial in views, say you've got some markup that's very similar between two components, right? So you've just got like this really big component, and you've got some markup that's similar between them that content authors would never put on the page independently of that big component, right? Maybe you can make that a partial so that that markup is shared between those two components, and then they can only put the bigger component on the page. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Time to go home?
A lot of good stuff, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay.
Ha ha ha.